right. Good afternoon, everybody jumping on here. Welcome to this, what will be an engaging and impactful, we hope, webinar all about men's issues and men getting involved in the pro-life movement. So my name is Jacob Immel. I have the privilege of working for a few different organizations, including Wisconsin Right to Life. I'm gathered here with a couple great speakers. We'll get to them in a second. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules and busy lives to be here. Essentially, what brought this up is you'll see all three of us are men, and we all work in some capacity in the pro-life movement. And we hear so often the different myths and misconceptions about the pro-life movement, what it means to be pro-life. And we often hear that, especially when it comes to men being in the movement, being pro-life activists. And we're kind of here to debunk that a little bit and to provide some perspective. So before we get any further, I want to introduce who we have here. First, we have Greg Mayo. Greg is a well-known speaker, nationally acclaimed speaker on pro-life men's topics and issues. He's also a well-known author of Almost Daddy, and as well as some other books and workbooks. Greg is really dynamic. He's a business owner as well, and he really brings a personal and unique touch to his work, which you'll hear when he talks a little bit more. We also have Sean Corcoran. Sean is the executive director of Men for Life. He's also an attorney and just an all-around good guy and men's life activist, pro-life men's activist. So you'll hear a little bit about their stories, what brought them personally and professionally into this. They're both authors, they're both speakers, they're both family men, and we're so excited to have them. I see people coming into the chat from all over, not just Wisconsin, but from all over the nation. We have Texas, we have Florida, we have Louisiana. So that's awesome. And we're glad that you're all representing. So how this is going to work is where the title of this is Reclaiming Masculinity. So we're going to talk about how we can reclaim our masculinity and take back what it means to be pro-life and advocates for women and for the unborn and for babies and all life in general. We're going to show a clip here in a little bit to get us started. Then we're going to have Sean start. He'll talk a little bit about his background and his organization. Then we'll have Greg talk a little bit about the same, their perspectives. And then we'll bring them both on and we'll kind of do a call to action. And they'll both be involved there. I'll kind of be keeping the flow and moderating as needed. I see people have put in the chat already different things. That's great. If you have any questions, we'll take the last little bit to just go over questions. So put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. We're going to cover a lot in this hour or less. So we're planning to do more of these. So let's get right into it. I'm going to share my screen in 1 second here. And then we're going to watch a clip that kind of talks about we wanted to kick off masculinity in a big way, in a healthy way, and what better than an action adventure movie? And I've never seen the movie, forewarning, but we know that the other guys here are big fans of Gladiator. Can everybody see? Can we see the clip here? Can you guys see it? All right. Okay, I was told here that maybe you couldn't hear the audio very well. But if you couldn't, it's just setting up one of the pivotal speeches from the movie Gladiator and just how cool it is to be unauthentically, just be authentically masculine and just protective of the innocent, right? So you don't have to have seen the movie to know that, and that's what we're here discussing today. So without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, Mr. Sean Corcoran, and we'll learn about him and his organization, and we'll go from there. Sean, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Okay. For those of you who aren't familiar with that scene, I know that it's really hard to be familiar with it when you can't hear anything. However, let me just share with you what that scene was and the impact that it would have had it come through. And that is the scene in The Gladiator where the gladiator, the main character, is down in the arena, and the emperor is demanding that he tell him his name. And he doesn't want to tell him his name because he knows the emperor, and the emperor says, "You will turn around and tell me your name." And he takes off his helmet and he says, "My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix legions, father to a murder, servant of the true emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next." And the reason that we chose that scene to start out with is because it's in 23 seconds. It's a really powerful scene where a man is able to clearly state in a way that inspires with conviction his identity. This is who I am. This is who I fight for. This is why I fight. And this is what I'm going to do about it. And so it's a really powerful scene. And I've played that scene for, I know Jacob said that he's never seen the movie. I played the scene for some Students for Life organizations in Texas, where everyone in the room was 19 years old, 36 people, five guys. And when I said, "Who's seen this movie?" 5 hands shot up. So 31 young ladies at 19 years old who had never seen this movie. And what was amazing about that scene, and I didn't really know what to expect because I didn't know that that was going to be the makeup of the room, was that during that scene, all 5 men were sitting on the edge of their seats because they saw, this is the kind of man that I want to be. This is a man who's able to say who he is and he believes in himself. And that's the kind of man that I want to be, which I expected. What I didn't expect was that all 31 of the young ladies were sitting on the edge of their seats because they recognized also that this is the kind of man who I want to meet, right? This is a man who knows who he is, what he's fighting for, and why he's fighting for it. And it's clear that he's going to do it. And that's really what we're called to do as men. And for so long, men have been sitting on the sidelines of the abortion fight. We've got one side that for 53 years has been saying, "Sit down, shut up, don't talk about this. This has nothing to do with you." And the other side has been so hyper-focused on moms and babies that we just sat down. Nobody was calling us to action. And the problem with that is that it's not up to the women in the pro-life movement who are focusing on moms and babies to call us to action in order for us to act, right? That's a failure of masculinity. It's up to us as men to say, "Hey, like, this is a real fight. This is a fight that is not only for the souls of our babies, for the hearts of the women in our lives, but this is a fight for humanity. This is a fight for the souls of everyone. And we play a part in this." That passivity that we look at is very similar to the passivity that we see in the beginning of the book of Genesis, where Adam is sitting there silently, passively. And I didn't even realize this until I started this job, really, and had started having conversations. But that Adam was sitting there the whole time the serpent was talking to Eve. She eats the apple, and then it says, "And she gave it to her husband who was there with her." So this man's sitting there, not acting like a man. He's failing in his masculinity, no doubt thinking it's her mouth, her choice, right? Just like we say, her body, her choice. And the consequences will fall on her, but the consequences didn't fall on Eve. They fell on all of humanity. And that's really where we are with abortion too, right? The consequences aren't just on women and babies. The consequences are on all of humanity. And we can see that trickle down effect or trickle up effect when we devalue human life at its purest form, in the form of an innocent child. Then we start to go all the way up to where now we have anyone who disagrees with us, right? If that baby who we see as maybe inconveniencing us, getting in our way, therefore not worth life, is not worth life, then a human who is standing in front of us, fully grown and having lived and experienced life and saying things that we disagree with, he certainly is getting in our way. And what happens next is we saw it a month ago, right? People start getting assassinated for disagreeing with us. We devalue all human life. And so I believe that it all comes from abortion. And I believe that a big part of that is men sitting back and being passive for too long. So real quick on me, since I went into a long talk about that. I am the CEO of Men for Life. I've been the CEO of Men for Life for just over a year. Prior to that, I was a practicing attorney. And prior to that, I was a homeless meth addict for about 7 years, all of which came after the loss of my first child to abortion. So I lost my first child to abortion when I was 19. Then I failed out of college. I failed out of college 2 more times. And I ended up in a 7-year methamphetamine addiction, homeless, unemployed, overdosing in a hotel room and waiting for the police to arrest me. And it wasn't until treatment, which I got into the next day by the grace of God, that the counselor helped me to connect the abortion to all of the behavior that I started doing after the abortion. Because in my mind, I was told that it didn't matter that I wanted my child. It didn't matter what I wanted. And so my thoughts didn't matter. And I didn't believe that I had any right to grieve or mourn. And so it never made sense to me that that would be the thing that would be driving me to all of these destructive behaviors. And in treatment, she helped me to connect those dots and help me to begin my healing process, in many of the ways that Greg is probably going to talk about when he talks about healing. And what she didn't tell me was that I wasn't alone, right? So I went another 8 years before I shared my story. And when I shared my story for the first time, I had 3 different men come up to me afterwards and say, "Hey, I haven't told anybody this in 20 years or in 30 years, but I lost a child to abortion." And sometimes it's men who fought against it like I did, and sometimes it's men who pushed for it. And in both circumstances, these men are struggling with the idea that they lost a child, and they haven't known how to deal with it because they thought they were alone. And I took that as a sign that God wanted me to share because it wasn't about me, it was about other men. And so I've continued to share. And in sharing, I was connected with Men for Life. And then when I stopped practicing law, they asked me to come and run the organization. And I'm very grateful that I have. It's been an amazing opportunity. The things that we are doing right now with Men for Life, we are creating a fatherhood program for pregnancy centers. I see several names on here who are familiar with that and the work that we are doing. We've talked before. We're creating a fatherhood program for pregnancy centers, knowing that just like 50 to 65% of women who see an ultrasound will choose life, 97% of men, this number comes from the Vitae Foundation this year, 97% of fathers who see an ultrasound and go through a fatherhood program choose life. So that's the other side of the equation that we've been missing out on for the past 53 years. And I think the pregnancy centers as a whole are driven to connect these men. And many of the centers and some of the guys that I see on here right now have been doing this for much longer than I have. And I appreciate that work. And so our program is based on, a lot like that first video, on masculinity. It's not based on how to change a diaper, how to bottle feed, how to swaddle. There's programs out there that do that. Our program is based on building the man, because if we can build the man and give him something he's inspired to be a part of, then he'll come back to that center and we can get that 97%. But more than that, we can change the man, and in changing the man, we can change the culture. With 3,000 pregnancy centers in this country, if we can each reach 50 men a year, that's 150,000 men a year we can change. And hopefully that can help us not only to change the man, but to bring him back into the family, and have a life affirming man who is biblically masculine. um, so that is the number one thing that we are doing right now. We are also starting a membership program for Men for Life, where we will help to equip men in the context of many of the people who are on this call to action. That's something that will be coming out. I'm really aiming for the end of this year, if not by the beginning of next year. I don't want to take too much time, Jacob, because I know I went off on a tangent.
No problem. Sean, what a great story. I've heard it before, but thank you so much for bearing your heart. And it's true. I mean, I think of when my wife and I had our child, holding my son for the first time, and it really kindled or awoke for the first time something in me to really want to provide even more and just be a role model. And I'm excited to have all these great men on the call and to get to know these guys a little bit better. So we're appreciative of Men for Life, and it's exciting to hear how it's growing and continuing to grow and launch programs. So thank you so much for that, Sean. Now we have Greg Mayo. Greg is a jack of all trades, businessman, speaker, author, husband, father, so many things. And he also, like Sean, has a great personal story. So we're excited that they both joined. And without further ado, let's have Greg.
Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate that. And Sean, thanks for that. And Sean and I are going to tie together kind of what we're doing and what we're talking about here in a little bit. But before I share my story, I really want to talk about a question I hear all the time. Where are the men? Why aren't they stepping forward? Why aren't they stepping into healing? Why don't men engage, right? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the big ones is fear. Fear brought about by emotional invalidation. And what that basically means is what Sean said earlier, men are told to shut up, sit down, you don't have a voice. And so imagine being a man with, it's either abortion minded or abortion wounded. And you read, I don't know, an op-ed written by a guy named Greg in Newsweek. And by the way, when that came out 3 years ago, there were like 2,400 comments. I want to share a couple of them with you. But imagine being an unhealed guy who's never talked about his story. And you see comments like, you're a man, your feelings aren't a real consideration here. How about you sit down and shut up? That's what men should do. If you would have kept your pants on, you wouldn't have this problem, right? And I could go on and on and on. But an unhealed man reads those comments and they think, oh, well, maybe I don't have an opinion. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. It's fear. It's fear of that being ostracized in a very public way, right? My wife and friends of mine encouraged me not to read the comments, but I did. And I didn't because I wanted to argue with lunatics. I read the comments because I wanted to reach that guy. I wanted to find that guy that posted, hey, I haven't told anybody but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because I get that everywhere I speak, and I have for 14 years now. The other thing I get, and I just did a keynote for a PRC banquet last week in Ohio. For those of you that don't know, I live in Indiana, so I'm one of y'all, one of the Midwestern guys, I guess. But I had people at that event coming up to me afterwards and saying, you know what, I never thought about the guy. Now, I appreciated their honesty, but let's be real, folks. It's 2025, and I was at a PRC banquet, and the awareness on men is still fairly low. So the question becomes why? Well, I'm going to tell you why. The main thing to me is the cultural messaging. Now, that clip from Gladiator that Sean spoke about, he and I both use that in our talks. I use it in a very different way. At one point in my talk, I'll say, look, I'm going to throw a movie quote out. And I don't do the accent, but I said, I'll tell the audience, I'm going to start speaking this movie quote. And when you know what it is, throw your hand up in the air and just keep it there. I get about 8 or 10 words in before every man in that room has their hand in the air. That's the power of culture. But let's look at it from a standpoint of abortion and men's role. And I'm just going to go through a couple movies really quick, or a few. Men are portrayed in a lot of different ways with unplanned pregnancies in the movies. The absent guy. Think of the movie Juno. These Walls Can Talk. Both cases, the men are absent from the discussion. There's the TV show Parenthood, or the movie Obvious Child, where the man's supportive in her decision, right? He says, I don't want the abortion, but whatever you do, I'll support you. There's the Invisible Man. There's a movie called Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. Say that 5 times fast, right? In that movie, the crux of the story is a teenage girl going across state lines to have an abortion. Not only is the dad of the baby not a factor in the movie, he's never even mentioned. Like, it has nothing to do with him. So with all those cultural messages, guys look and go, I guess I don't have a place in this thing. Um, and I think that's a real damaging problem in the media and the culture, and that's why we have to change that. We'll talk more about that later when Sean and I are kind of talking together. The other reason men don't come forward into healing or to talk is shame. And we understand the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame, right? Healthy shame is I did bad. Toxic shame is I am bad. So healthy shame's from God. We call that guilt, convicted by the Holy Spirit. You know, a lot of different ways to talk about it. But you're redeemable, you're forgivable, you're fixable. Toxic shame says none of that. It says you are flawed to your core and you will never be accepted or forgiven by Christ. Um, and let's look at the stats that support that. In a study done in 2022 by Shepard Research out of Oklahoma City, of men impacted by abortion, they found that 7%, only 7, would go to a clergy member or a church leader for help with their abortion wounding. That's toxic shame, folks, right? And that's very damaging. And that part of that toxic shame and that emotional validation is what kept me out of healing for 21 years after my first abortion loss, which happened at 18. Had another one at 22. I dropped out of college too and went back and dropped out and went back. And in the 4 years after high school, I lived in 6 states and 11 cities. Um, couldn't hold a job. I mean, all these things were part of the fallout of the abortion loss. And that I call the emotional fallout. And nobody was talking about it back then. Nobody was talking about men and abortion. I saw a therapist at 24, and about 8 sessions in, I brought up my abortion story, and he kind of leaned back and went, yeah, that's not really a thing. Tell me more about your dad. Well, you're a mental health professional, bro, right? I mean, what am I supposed to do with that? Um, and it wasn't until I was 39 and doing a book study that had nothing to do with abortion where the Holy Spirit nudged me to tell my story. And I didn't want to. I went to church with all these guys. They're friends of mine. None of them talked about abortion, so why should I, right? But it did. And I was scared to death. And I told my story. And by the end of the night, out of a room of 14 guys, 3 other guys had stopped me and said, hey, look, I've never told anybody, but. And kind of like Sean mentioned, so for the first time, Jacob, the first time in 21 years, I was like, whoa, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who feels this. That began my healing journey. That began the journey of sharing my story, because every time I did, a guy would come up and say, I never told anybody, but this is my story. And then somebody else would come up and say, I never thought about the guy, which obviously continues to this day. And I do a lot of PRC banquets, so does Sean, and I hear that all the time. And I think that that's one of the big problems. And for people that think, well, okay, that's you and Sean, okay, you guys, but you're doing the thing. Of course, it's you guys. I want to share just a couple stats real quick, and then I want to talk a little bit about healing. In that same Shepard research study, they found that 73% of the men said that they felt pain of some kind, emotional pain, anger, depression, anxiety, depression. I already said depression after the abortion loss. 73%. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting. 82% of these men said that they wanted help or tried to find help dealing with their emotional pain. 82%, that's almost all of them, y'all, especially the way public schools grade now. I think that's an A now. But anyway, but here's the troubling part. Only 18% said they knew where to go to get help. So there's no context for men out there. I protested the first, both of them, but I protested the first abortion, and her mom said this is going to happen anyway. And so I dropped back and punted and did what every single cultural message said. I was supportive. I went to the clinic with them. And that was one of the most hellish experiences of my life. I could drive you there right now. It's not abortion clinic anymore. But so 18% said they knew where to get help. And over half of that 18% said that the place that they would go get help, anybody want to guess? I know you can't, you're all on mute, but Planned Parenthood. Men that said where they knew where to get help said that they would get help at Planned Parenthood. Uh, the sheer cognitive disconnect for someone to come to that conclusion, it's a failure on not getting the message out. It's a failure on not winning the cultural battle. And there's 1 in 5 men in this country that are impacted by abortion loss by the time they're 45. Now, I think that stat's a little light. I think it's probably closer to 1 in 4, which is the number largely accepted for women. But let's just say it's 1 in 5. Fine. 1 in 5 men impacted. And a lot of them have never connected the dots between their abortion wound and their acting out behaviors, their addictions, whatever they're into, whatever they try to do to numb the pain. So if that's the case, if 1 in 5, if there's millions of men out there, then we need to find these men and let them know that healing opportunities are available. Because my abortion, the first one, I always say the first one hurt me, the second one hardened me. It changed who I was. It changed how I saw women, how I interacted with them. It changed how my marriage acted when I finally got married when I was 30. It changed how I parented. It literally, there's no part of your life that's untouched when you have an abortion loss. Whether you fought against it, fought for it, that doesn't matter. And there are a lot of different healing opportunities, but they have to be psychological and spiritual. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, Jacob. I have so many guys, and maybe Sean, you do too, that tell me, oh, well, yeah, I prayed and God forgave me. I'm like, yeah, I believe he did. But what about healing? Well, no. Jesus forgave me. No, right. I get that. Jesus forgives. But St. Augustine said, God will provide the wind, but it is man that must raise the sail. So what are you doing to raise your sails? And that's another disconnect. And it's also based on shame. We have to help these men get into healing. What Sean talked about with his program of stopping the abortion and then training these men to be men and to be fathers is of vital importance. It absolutely is. We have to stop men going along with this stuff and not being true, authentic men. But we also have to heal the millions that have already been impacted. And somebody posted in the thing about the link. I'll be happy to share the link to the research study. Jacob, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Greg. What a moving story, a touching story, and I think just inspirational about how we can really pursue that call to action that we'll talk about shortly. I think it's so important to have men that are just, we need to be authentic. We need to talk about how we're feeling. And I think it's so important to find that group of men around you. My wife and I lead a small group. We lead a Bible study at our church, and it's so amazing to walk alongside men. And it's important. If you don't have that group of men, whether it be at work or at church, in a different ministry or volunteer group, we can always connect you. We will send this out for those that couldn't join the whole time. But we're not done yet. We have a lot of good stuff left. So now we're going to have Greg and Sean collaborate and talk together. We're going to kind of talk about what the solution is, right, to the problem of men not getting involved, not feeling comfortable, shame, all of that combined into one. And we're going to come up with practical solutions of how we can get involved and how we can move forward. So, gentlemen, let's jump in.
And Jacob, before we start on that, there is one other thing I want to touch on, because I do see some people on here who are associated with pregnancy centers, and especially when we're talking about reaching those young men and whether or not abortion really impacts the men. I think, as Greg said, there's from the pregnancy center that he did last week, and I had this exact same experience at the banquet that I did on Tuesday, 2 days ago. When I was speaking to them before I went and talking about how we're doing a fatherhood program, they were very hesitant. And they said, well, I don't know about that. I don't know if we want to have the dads there, because, the dads are the ones who drive the abortion most of the time. And I had to make a point when I spoke to let them know that that's really old thinking, that's not an accurate statement. Now, while many times it may be that when mom comes in and they say, well, what's going on? They don't have a good relationship with dad, and they say that. Or it may be that dad doesn't know what to say, and he says, I'll support whatever you want, or your body, your choice, which the woman from research from the Vitae Foundation believes means they're not supportive and they want her to have an abortion. And so that may be coming there, but the reality is that I think, and many of the people who are on here and who are working on this throughout the country know that the men want to be dads. You know, the men. There's a new survey that came out. I think it came out last week or the week before, that showed that the men surveyed, in a list of 13 options, you know, what is the number one priority in your life, and they chose family as one. Like number one was their option before marriage, you know, and the the extrapolation of that conversation went, well, maybe it's because they want family, and then they're thinking, how do I get a family? Well, I need to be married, and then I need to worry about finances. And so they kind of went through that logical order, but family was number one. And so I think that's old school thinking, to think men are the ones driving abortion. We really need to break ourselves out of that. The other thing that I want to touch on, you know, for the people that are on the front lines and have the opportunity to meet these men and are wondering, does it really impact men, is the data out of the study out of Denmark using socialized medicine, where, not a voluntary study, not a pro-life country, where they found that studying 8,221 men who had lost a child to abortion, that these men were up to 4.5 times more likely to seek mental health professionals. They were 90% more likely to be on antidepressants after the abortion, 79% more likely to be on anti-anxiety medications, and 74% more likely to be on prescription sleep aids. So abortion really, really does affect men. And that is one of the reasons that we can have the impact, that men can have an impact, because it affects men for a reason. It affects men because men want to be fathers, and we have a call to masculinity to protect, right? So whether we recognize that at the moment or we don't, you know, it's going to affect us if we don't fulfill that call to masculinity, because that comes from God and we can't get past that. So I just wanted to touch on those two things, and I can share the research out of Denmark too. I'll have to do it after this because I can't reach my computer screen from where I'm at. Sorry, Jacob. I wanted to hit on those things before we jumped into the next section.
No problem. Yeah, we'll go on to the solution here. So Greg, Sean, we can take you guys can tag team this, but just kind of go over how we can kind of change the culture. I know that's, yeah, let's talk about that in 5 minutes, but how can we start to influence the culture? How can we engage? What are some practical ways that the men here, or the women in their lives that are maybe listening, how can we get these things moving?
Well, let me permit me to jump in here quick and start with a quote. Michael Fichter, the president of Indiana Right to Life, published a book this year called Upstream: Why a Jesus-Centered Heart is a Key to Ending Abortion. It's a terrific book. I recommend it to everybody. I don't get commission for recommending it, just so we're clear. But it's a terrific book, and I want to share this quote. He says, in the sphere of abortion, culture, i.e. the hearts and minds of the people, far exceeds the significance of the Supreme Court, the White House, the Senate, the House, and every state legislature in the nation. Why? Because politics is always downstream from the culture. So to me, that's such a powerful quote, and it's such a powerful truth, just in the short examples I shared. We have to change the culture. Everybody knows Gladiator. Everybody knows Indigo Montoya's speech, you know, killed my father, prepared to die. Men talk amongst movie quotes. In fact, I would suggest that we know our tribe based on what movies we quote, right? So we have to have cultural messaging out there, not only in the news and the media for sure, but also in the entertainment world, that shows a decisively pro-life stance, that shows men being authentically masculine, and that also shows men that they can heal, right? That's my 2 cents on it, Sean.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, I think that what you just said is really important. The way that I like to say it is, we can change all the laws we want, but people say, well, if you make abortion illegal, people are going to do it illegally, right? And they're right. Like, that's true, especially with the abortion pill. They're just going to do it. So the question isn't, can we change the laws? Although we need to change the laws. Like, I support changing the laws, and I support making abortion illegal. But however that looks and over what time it takes is just not the path that I'm choosing to go on. I think that more importantly is changing the culture. I think that changing the culture is how we get this done. I think we can change the culture by bringing men back into the family. I think we bring men back in the family by giving them the message of authentic masculinity and letting them know that it is based on biblical principles. And by going through the idea that biblical masculinity or authentic masculinity is really just transforming this notion that that I'm living for me, right? And I'm doing what I want to do. And I'm going to go make a bunch of money. I'm going to buy a Bugatti. I'm going to get the woman I want, right? Where the reality is you go make a bunch of money, you buy a Bugatti, and you get the woman who wants that. And then when that's gone, she's gone. And what we're really called to do is build ourselves up to become the man that the woman who God created for us deserves, right? And that's a completely different thing because that is a masculinity for others. That is to protect, to provide, to lead, and to serve. To live for something greater than yourself. And so, I think that is how we change the culture. And so many of these young men have never gotten that message when they come into the pregnancy center, and that's really a good starting point. And outside of the pregnancy center as well. But we in the pro-life movement, that is our boots on the ground, right? Like that is who is in the face or face to face is a better way to say that, with the people who are in the unplanned pregnancies. And so reaching those young men, I think, is really how we change the culture, and that gets us to the idea of what can men do? What can men here do? And man, and as I look at some of the names of the participants on this call, like some of them are already doing this, and for those of you who are looking for, hey, what can I do? The people in the pregnancy centers know that in order to reach these young men and teach them how to be men, they need men, and if there's 3,000 pregnancy centers in this country, then there's 3,000 pregnancy centers that need men to help facilitate these fatherhood programs. And so what's really important is for us as men to recognize that while these young men are yearning for a message of masculinity, even if they don't know that's what it is, there's a reason that people like Andrew Tate are so popular, right? Because he's giving them something and they think that's what they want to hear, even though it's a false ideology of masculinity. And so what they need is to hear the reality, like authentic masculinity. We as men in an older generation, and I always say our generation, meaning anyone over the age of 25 who can reach these young men, what we have a yearning to, right? We're called as men to raise the next generation of men. We get into this Western civilization idea that, we're all for ourselves, and we kind of forget this how it used to be, where before the Industrial Revolution, the boys were by our side. They were watching us. They were learning how we do things all day long. And I think there's a real resurgence in America, especially in conservative America, to regain that. But outside of our own sons, we have an opportunity to fulfill that mentorship role with these young men who may not have ever had a father. Because if we think about it, if we're going to sit back and we're going to say, man, and this is a generational thing. I mean, I remember when I was little hearing my grandfather say this about the young men in that generation. But to say, man, like these young men, like they suck. They don't have any idea what it means to be a man. These boys don't know what it means to be a man. We are doomed, right? Every generation, when they get to a certain point, looks down and says, God, we're doomed. But if we can look at this next generation of young men and we can say, hey, like they have no idea how to be a man, but we can recognize that they didn't have fathers, they didn't have mentors, they didn't have male role models, and we don't fill that void, then we are failing in our own masculinity, because who else is going to do it? We're not built to complain as men, right? We're built to fix things. That's part of being a man, to fix things. And so, if we can identify the problem, then we can fix the problem, right? We can create solutions. And so I think it's really important that that as men we take action and that we get in there. And I always tell everybody the first thing you can do is volunteer at the pregnancy centers. I don't believe they can have too many male volunteers. Sidewalk Advocates for Life is another opportunity, or, whether it's associated with that specific group or not, to go out to the sidewalks outside of the abortion clinics where they still exist, and serve a couple of roles. One is to just have a male presence, because there's a lot of women out there who could be attacked, but are less apt to be attacked. And I mean by words in vulgarity and obscenities and hatred, more than I mean physically, but having that male presence on the sidewalk can really stem off some of that. The other thing on the sidewalk is that those dads who aren't allowed in the abortion clinics, nobody's talking to them, right? They're not allowed in, and so they're just standing on the sidewalk, And I've talked to sidewalk advocates who have gone up to those young men and said, "Hey, how are you feeling about this?" And the stories of these guys who say, "Man, I want this baby, but I don't. It's not my choice," And so to really fill them with a message of hope and give them that male connection, because we all need that. As men, we need that male connection. And so to fill them with that message of hope and to say, "Hey, um, you still have a chance here." And I've heard stories of that having an impact where the young man went in, or however he was able. I don't know what security's like at Planned Parenthood, but somehow at least one story where he was able to connect with the mom, and she came out crying because she wanted this baby, but believed when he said it's your choice that he didn't want the baby. And so now they both, have this baby that they both wanted. And so I think that that those are two ways, through the pregnancy centers and through the sidewalk advocacy, that men can have a real impact today, right? Without getting too deep into too many different things. Just what can I do today? If every man called a pregnancy center and said, "Hey, I want to volunteer," and I've had that happen here where I live, and the pregnancy centers didn't even have a fatherhood program yet, but now they can, right? And now they know they have men who are going to facilitate it. And so I think it's really powerful, and it's a way for us. You know what it takes to to facilitate a fatherhood program? You just have to be a man around other men. So every single man is qualified. Like, that's all you're doing, is being your authentic self around young men so that they can see that example.
And that's a great point. You don't have to be a post-abortive man to work at a pregnancy center or volunteer. You have to have a heart for these young men, right? And I think that's the most important thing. And to Sean's point about like sidewalk advocates and that kind of thing, there is an absolute huge value to a man being there. But there's not a value to protest. And let me explain what I mean. When I was 18, and like I said earlier, I went to the clinic, and I was inside for about 7 seconds or so. They asked me to wait out on the steps. And so I'm sitting there looking around. I'm trying to process everything that's going on in my life at the moment. And I look over in the grassy area by the parking lot, and there were poster boards. There had been a protest either that morning, excuse me, or the day before. I don't remember which. But they said, "Baby killer, burn in hell." One of them had a picture of a mangled fetus, and all this stuff. You know what that made me think in that moment? Oh, you're those Christian people, right? Stay away from them. But to have a calm presence and to be on the sidewalk praying, to be a man praying, to be a man that sees that guy get out of the car, or like Sean said, just sitting in his car waiting, and says, "Hey, brother, come here." Not only the protective factor of being there for the women, but so there's a huge value to that. I had a pastor ask me once if I thought protests were wrong at abortion clinics. And I said, "Well, let me turn it back to you another way, dude. Are they effective? Where's the win?" Because I would argue that there isn't one. And the other thing with PRCs, when I first got healing, I called PRCs in the area and I asked to volunteer, told them my story. They're all very kind, but they said, "We really don't have stuff for guys." Now, that should never be the answer. And I tell PRCs when I speak to them all the time, I, have him fix a doorknob, have him build a shelf for copy paper. I mean, if he's there and he wants to help, get him doing, because like Sean said, we're men, we fix stuff. We don't want to talk about stuff we want to fix stuff. So give him something to do where he's a productive part of the center, and then work him in um, to working with young guys when they come in. And I'll tell you something else, PRCs, I think, and now we've got some examples of this around the country. Alpha Grand Rapids and some other places are doing cool stuff, but we need to understand that when a guy wants to volunteer to PRC, we need to address
I'm
him,
going to interrupt real
interact
quick,
with,
Greg, because
huh?
someone asked what a PRC was, and I think that's really important as we
Oh,
continue.
Pregnancy Resource Center. I'm sorry. Um, Gosh, I've been saying that for 40 minutes and should have prefaced. But last point on that, if a guy comes in and he wants to volunteer or help, you have to be able to address him and interact with him like a man would understand, right? You have to talk to him like a man, not like you would talk to a woman. Anyway, Sean, go ahead.
That was it. I just,
Uh,
I saw that come up, and I thought it was really important because we've been talking about it, and I don't know how many times I've said it too, but I think that's an important thing to to kind of touch on. And I know we've got like 10 minutes left, and we've got a couple of really good questions on here, so I don't want to go too far in this, but I do want to say this. In addition to what I'll call, look, this is how I put it, and I'm bold in this because it's what I believe. But I believe that abortion in its current state is the product of failed masculinity, and I can do, and I have done an entire talk on that. But that's what I believe. So so if we look at that, I think that men failing to speak, right? If we're in a spiritual war, which we are, we're in a spiritual war, and and if we're told in Ephesians 6:14 that the first thing we need to do to prepare for the spiritual war when we're putting on the full armor of God is to put on the belt of truth, right? Truth is the most important thing that we have in this weapon in this spiritual war because Satan is the father of lies. And so that is what we're fighting, right? We're fighting a spiritual war based on lies and truth. And so it's so important for men, first and foremost, to understand that a part of their masculinity is to stand up and speak the truth, and to speak the truth boldly, and to speak the truth confidently, and to not step down because they're told I mean, I get death threats. I've been told many times that my ceiling should be painted red with my blood. There's a lot of hatred. My daughter should be raped, right? That way I will get it because that's what comes from the other side. And so you can't back down when the insanity comes, because the insanity comes from Satan, and we are called to be reflections of Christ. And so what's most important as men, if we're not speaking boldly in the truth, then why would the people behind us be confident to speak boldly in the truth? And just as that is true, I believe that that there's a widespread failure amongst the churches to speak the truth when it comes to abortion. So, what can we do about it as men? Go to our pastors, share this information, invite them to hear from someone else. If you don't feel confident at this point to share this information, ask them if they're open to having a conversation. I will talk to any priest or pastor about how important this is. And I've had some successful conversations, and I've had some conversations where I feel like we just went in circles, and I don't think that anything's going to change. And and that's not my job. My job isn't to change them. My job is to share the truth. And so, getting the churches to talk about it, because when the church is failing to speak about abortion, then what's happening is we've got the young people in the front, right, who are not hearing the message of how destructive it is to society, and therefore don't believe that it's that big of a deal. Right. And then they're the ones that are going to show up at the abortion clinic or at the pregnancy center. We've got the people in the back who have suffered because of a loss of abortion, whether it was their choice or not, and and believe there's no hope for redemption because it is murder. And there is a point in the life of every person who has had an abortion who understands that they have killed an innocent human life. And if they are not met with a message of hope and redemption and saving through Jesus Christ, then they are not going to believe that. And so it is incumbent upon the churches to speak, but it's incumbent upon us as men to go to those priests and pastors and to say, hey, like, we have to be talking about this. it's important. And here's why. And if that's what if I say, if you're not confident to say, here's why, then ask them if they'll have a conversation with me. I've got no more fundraisers for 2025. So I've got lots of time and a phone. If they want to talk, I'll talk.
I would question whether you have lots of time. I know you and your schedule.
I'm sorry. Between 8 and 3 when my kids are at school.
Hey guys, do you think we could take one or two quick questions?
I would like to take all 4 of them that I've seen.
Oh, okay. Well, let's take one of them about what's your, you guys can tag team or jump in. What's your advice to parents raising boys? Just on what we talked about in general.
I think it's a good question because my boys are 10, 7, and 7, and Greg's are adults. So if I can start, when I go and to speak at a pregnancy center banquet or any pro-life function, and I share my story of abortion laws and everything that I believe about abortion, and I'll tell you, I've got 5 kids on the other side of that door right now because it's fall break, and our babysitter bailed on us today. So they know what I do, and that's the best part about this job. It's so much better than practicing law. They know what I do, they know why I do it, and they know what this fight is. But I bring them with me when I go and speak, and that's because I don't think it's too early, right? I don't think it can ever be too early, and people are going to have different levels of comfort with how they share the information and at what point. But if the other side is screaming and yelling and calling us names because we want to force a 10-year-old who has been raped to have a baby, then they are already acknowledging that 10 years old is at least the age that we should be having these conversations. Mm-hmm. Right? Because they can't say, I can't believe you would force this child, this 10-year-old to give birth and not let them have an abortion, but say you can't even talk to them about it, right? And so I'm very open with my kids, and I have to be sure to tell them that the things we talk about at home aren't the things that everybody talks about at home, and so you can't go to school and teach people about abortion, because I did get that phone call one day, and so I think that that's important, but I think you want to be honest, because this is life. And if they don't hear it from you, they're going to hear it on Netflix. They're going to hear it on YouTube. They're going to hear it from their friends. They're going to hear it from social media, whether they have social media or not. That doesn't mean they're not seeing it. And so I think it's important that we share this stuff at an early age.
Agree. And my response will be a lot shorter because, like Sean said, all my sons are adults, youngest being 23, but I was very honest with them as they were coming up about my abortion loss, what it was, what it meant, how it affected stuff, all the things. And one of my older boys has kind of strayed away and developed a bit of a rebellious spirit when he was younger. Well, anyway, he came to me, and all of them raised in the church, by the way, but he came to me one day and he said, my girlfriend's pregnant. And I said, oh, like nothing. He said, don't worry, Pop. Abortion's not on the table. You're going to have a granddaughter. And I do. She's almost 6, and she was just here the other day. So, important note to fathers, look, you can raise your kids in the church, but they will make their own decisions when they get older. Am I excited about the choice he made to engage in that kind of relationship before marriage? No. But I'm excited that because of my honesty about the impact, that partially influenced his conversation with her, like, no, this isn't an option. And though, so Sean's right, those are the conversations we got to have. And with his boys, even younger and younger, because they're hearing it younger and younger from other places. So, next question.
Well, and then I do want to, Chelsea's question was very long, and she's got a couple other points to it. And, and I think that an amazing thing that's happening this year is Vitae Foundation is doing a study on men and abortion. And the purpose of the study is to, how do we message the men so that they can say the right thing to mom in an unplanned pregnancy? So those results have just started trickling out, and they'll continue to trickle out throughout this year. I will have Brandy Meeks, the president of the Vitae Foundation, on the Men for Life podcast coming up here this month to discuss those findings. But I think that I think that what's important is that in the instance that that a young man is faced Like the biggest picture part of it is that in the instance that a young man is faced with an unplanned pregnancy, and mom's biggest fears are, am I going to be alone? How is this going to affect me? Am I going to be able to do this financially? Am I going to be able to do this relationally? You know, what is this going to be like? It's all going to be on me. That is the answers, the questions that he is answering, right? That he's answering the questions of her concerns, because those are her concerns. Her concerns aren't, um, is this a baby, right? They know it's a baby. And so the concern isn't, is this a baby? The concern is, am I going to be alone, and how am I going to be able to do this by myself? And so those are the concerns that the young man needs to be able to address by letting her know that he is here and he is ready to step up, and she is not going to be alone in this. And so I think that answers, something that I saw that was really important in that question.
All right, love that, guys. Let's quick talk about the culture. Somebody said that there's a lot of maybe the courage, lack of courage for men to step up, or insecurities, what have you. Is that stemming from culture?
Yeah, I'm looking for that question. That was a really good question. Yes. So I do think that the real issue is a lack of culture in so many men, especially when it comes to the pressures related to abortion and to having children and to not speaking truth, because we're told that as men we're not allowed to talk about this. And so, to the question of how do we correct that? I think it's by setting an example. I think it's about normalizing men talking about abortion. I think that's a really big deal. I think the more that we normalize men talking about abortion, the less of an impact it's going to have when people are screaming, "You're not allowed to talk about this." And and I think there's a huge shift culturally in it's just becoming harder and harder to take the other side seriously, because they're not shifting at all in their thought. They're saying things that they clearly can't possibly believe anymore. And so if you can't take them seriously, it's way easier to be bold, right? But I think that a big deal is mentoring and setting an example for these young men. You speaking truth, you speaking confidently, you being the one who is doing this. I like to say that none of us, I'm guessing none of us, maybe Jared Mayo, wants to be a social media influencer, right? And he would be really good at it. I don't know that he really wants to be a social media influencer. However, we do want to influence the next generation, and that is where they're at. And so I would encourage anyone to to make videos just talking about it, because they're going to see that. Our videos and Men for Life, starting at 0 across all platforms, have had over 1 million views since January. So people are seeing it, and not everybody likes it, but if one young man sees it and says, "Hey, if he can talk like that, and say something that's true, then I can do it." And that was so great about Charlie Kirk, right? Like, that's what he did. He was confident in speaking the truth and inspired other people to speak the truth. So that is the biggest tool that we have as men, is to get off the sidelines and speak the truth. Because if we can be confident speaking the truth, then the young men that are following us, they can grow in confidence in speaking the truth.
All right. Do you guys have any final thoughts? I think we'll probably wrap up here, so we'll respect people's time. But any final thoughts? And I'll close with a couple announcements and next steps. So any closing thoughts from you guys?
I guess so. The last thing I will say, because we are over on time, is if you have more questions, you want to continue the conversation, reach out to any of the three of us. We've barely scratched the surface today, folks, of what men need to do and how they can become more involved. But I think the biggest takeaway I hope for everyone is that men that have already been impacted by abortion need healing. And there are a lot of opportunities for that out there. And that we need to encourage men to stand up and be authentic men and stand up for life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, if you're interested in what we're doing, you can find the place to sign up for the Men for Life emails at menforlife.org. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to start. We are working on a membership program. Part of the reason that we're doing that is to educate and equip men to be able to speak confidently about this stuff, right? And I'll ask Anne, do you mind typing our email addresses into the chat box?
So we'll send all that out in an email too.
Okay, cool.
Everyone here,
so that's one of the things that we really want to do is to equip men and everyone really, but to equip people to be able to speak confidently about this, and to give men especially a community to be able to come together and to talk about these things, so that we can all feed off of each other. You know, there is some great fatherhood communities of fatherhood coordinators that currently exist, and I've been able to watch how together that community is able to grow each other. And so I kind of want to do the same thing for men in general who are interested in becoming active in the pro-life movement, to give them that community, but also to equip them with tools so that they can go out and speak confidently.
Well, guys, thank you so much. What a great discussion this was on what it means to be pro-life, what are practical steps, why men maybe are hesitant, what the culture says, what is our mandate as men, right? And how we can be effective fathers, advocates, husbands, community members. So we will send this out to everyone that not just was here, but registered. So we want you to share this if possible. We're also going to include the relevant links to everyone here and what we're up to. So for Greg, GregMayoAuthor.com. We'll also send that out. If you didn't get your pen out, GregMayoAuthor.com. For Sean, menforlife.org, menforlife.org. Like I said, we'll send that out. But yeah, talk to your local pregnancy center. If you need help, we can help you maybe get one started, a fatherhood group, coalition. These men really said it well. We need to get our churches involved. So let's talk to our men's ministers, ministries, our pastors. Somebody put in the chat, wouldn't it be great to have these guys speak to your men's group? I do that as well. These guys do it great. There's several guys that work at Wisconsin Right to Life. That would be amazing. Reach out to any of us here, and we would definitely come and do that. So 123givelife.com is also a great resource for men and women. That's if you want to find a pregnancy resource center near you for whatever you're going through. But in this case, this would be great to just see who your local pregnancy center is and reach out to see if they have one of these groups, if they need more men. If not, maybe how you can get started. So like I said, we'll send this out. We really appreciate you all being here, and let this be a call to action, and let's make this just the very beginning. So thank you all for joining us. God bless.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.